this, essentially. Each person will give a presentation, and then we'll open up for questions. We have 3 different presentations here. Our first speaker is Nathaniel Raymond from the Humanitarian,
Harvard Humanitarian.
Harvard Humanitarian Initiative here on campus. Our second speaker is Rena Goes from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And our third speaker is Zachary Patterson from Concordia University in Canada. With that, I'm just going to turn it over to Nathaniel. And
All right. Can you hear me okay? Great. So first of all, I want to thank Wendy and Ben and everyone at the Center for Geographic Analysis for having me here today. To start off, let me tell you a story which I think in a microcosm shows the problems that the humanitarian field has with integrating remote sensing and geospatial data into disaster response operations. So about, how long ago was it? Last year, we published our first satellite imagery interpretation guide at the Signal Program on Human Security and Technology, which I direct at HHI. And this imagery interpretation guide focused on displaced population camps, refugee camps, internally displaced persons camps, and trying to identify repeating types of structures to support humanitarian actors in using imagery in response. We got a lot of incredible and surprising feedback from humanitarian professionals. And what they said is, this is fantastic. We use it all the time. And I said, that's great. I'm very surprised that there's this level of adoption. They said, yeah, we use it for the ground photographs because there's no book where we have pictures of what the tents look like on the ground in one place. Let that sink in a second. We created an imagery interpretation guide, and what they were most interested in is someone finally coming up with a ground guide for indicators that we thought they knew all along. In that microcosm is really the heart of the problem. And often we as mappers, as geographers, we make it a lot worse by not realizing that that problem exists. We give our colleagues, and I say this also as a former humanitarian responder myself, we give humanitarians too much credit for being geospatial ready. We assume that they have already figured out what the analog antecedents are in terms of observable objects and imagery. They haven't, and I'm going to talk about why. So basically, that imagery interpretation guide came out of the journey that we took as a Signal program to start doing what we're doing. And some background. In 2010, I get a call from George Clooney, that George Clooney, who got a memo that I written 5 years ago for Google after being in Biloxi, Mississippi with Oxfam in response to Katrina. And I wrote a memo basically about what I call digital invisibility, that I observed when I was there in Biloxi that the primarily African-American population around Division Street on the peninsula, about 72 hours after Katrina, they had still not received federal assistance. Over in the primarily white, more affluent part of town, there was all the king's horses and all the king's men. And one particularly poignant expression of this is I talked to an 80-year-old woman who had not had her meds in several days because of Katrina, and she's sitting there in her Sunday best in the middle of a disaster site because she put on her Sunday best because she wanted to save it as the floodwaters came up. And I said, as Black Hawks are flying overhead, have you seen anybody from the US government? And she said, they keep flying over, but they don't land. And so I wanted to understand that. And what I began to realize is even then, this is 11 years ago, that it wasn't an issue of intentional neglect or racism. there were aspects of that happening, but really what was occurring is that there was a digitally invisible population. The primarily white population had access to cell phones and generators. They were communicating, they became very bright to responders. And so in the memo to Google, it's basically saying, how can we combine streams of information about populations to try to create equity in digital brightness and darkness as we try to assess populations. And so Clooney gets the memo, which to this day astounds me, because I don't think they read it at Google, but they read it in Hollywood. And he says, hey, could you do this, what you're talking about? And what he was wanting, it became the Satellite Sentinel project, which was the largest remote sensing deployment by civil society ever, and I still think to date at this scale, to monitor near real time threats to civilians and evidence of alleged mass atrocities. And we went into that program coding not just ones and zeros and not just building log frames. We were coding assumptions and aspirations into our technology, and assumptions and aspirations about how it could be used by different actors. And what we walked out of there realizing is that we have all this technology, we have data, but there's 4 things that the humanitarian and human rights community, but in particular the human rights community, didn't have to integrate, and I'm using that word intentionally, to really integrate remote sensing insights into decision making and into action. And those 4 things were technical standards, a theory of actionability, a theory of what constitutes data that can be used for decision support. So some examples of those gaps, I think the big one is what we call task to tool match. We are reinventing the wheel every disaster. You only have to go back to Nepal. It all blurs together. Was that last year? So basically in Nepal, we not only had a massive coordination breakdown on imagery, but we didn't have a triage procedure to say, what are the top 5 tasks that we need to do in the first 48 hours? What are the tools, regardless of whether or not remote sensing needs to be one of them? But what's our theory of our tool match to that task? And what data points, and how are we going to know we have them, relate to what delivery actions? Let me give you a concrete example. Hypothetical. Nepal hits. Our task 1, egress. Are the bridges out? Is the airport up, right? And so we're going to have indicators for how we're going to execute that plan, and then what we do if we get a result. That doesn't exist at all, okay? And so what we've been doing is we've been building bright, shiny objects and apps. Please don't build any more apps, okay? No more hackathons. I mean, we're attacking $1 million problem with 5 and dime investments and being okay with 25-cent impact. And we're doing it in this siloization where these fundamental non-technology problems are actually, not only are they not being addressed, we're making them worse, which I'll get to. So, and then my computer decided it didn't like me. So we've got these technical standards and operational standards and theories. Huge gap. Second thing we realized in Sentinel, there is no ethical principle that we can draw on for making decisions about what's fundamentally a type of data we don't have a name for yet. So next month, I'm releasing a book chapter where I try to name the type of data we were creating. Our ethical standards are for PII. What's PII? Personally identifiable information. Well, what I suggest is that we are creating DII, demographically identifiable information. Individual consent, PII protections, all of that comes out of the medical ethics tradition of institutions interacting with individuals. But now we're creating demographically identifiable data sets about some of the most vulnerable populations in the world, and our ethical antecedents have no relationship to those issues. So as we say in Western Massachusetts, where I'm from, we hit a fork in the road and we took it. We ran into no clear ethical guidance, so we keep using the old one, right? And you can follow your code of conduct with your voluntary technical organization, still kill people, and technically not violate it. And I'll get to that in a second. So where we're going, we may not need roads, to quote Back to the Future, but we do need ethics. And we have to do it intentionally, and we have to do it as a community, and we have to do it based on evidence. The third thing is training. There is not a humanitarian remote sensing center of training. So that's why next week, on Monday, we launched the first remote sensing for humanitarian program management course ever, and here at Harvard. And we offered 20 spots. We have 22 to 23 participants. The demand is high because now we're having to retrofit a deployment management capacity without a curriculum, without a pedagogy, onto organizations that are now already using this without the ethics, without the technical standards, and without education for their managers. The last thing is basically what I call absorptive capacity. We talk a lot about initial adoption of innovations, but what is especially true in the humanitarian context is your innovation is only going to be adopted to the degree to which the institutions can culturally and on a human resources level absorb your innovation into decision making. We have focused so much on trying to code in efficiency, how we port the data, how we apply an algorithmic feature extraction, that we really haven't developed a science of what are the absorptive requirements. So let me take a real world example. When I was with Oxfam International after the Boxing Day tsunami, the UN deployed something called the Donor Assistance Database, or DAD. That was a bad optic in terms of trying not to seem paternalistic, naming your program DAD. And we had a literal problem with DAD as we tried to deploy it in the field. And I had worked with the UN Special Envoys for Tsunami Recovery, and we're putting this unfunded mandate without a ground capacity in terms of electrical grids to support running the computer without staff trained in it, and at the expense of other emergency operations. So we're saying our data management and accountability requirements supersede what you are capable to do at the expense of helping people. Okay, we're doing that over and over again because we are coming from it thinking that our efficiency in terms of the ones and zeros is the proof of concept point, right? It's actually the ability of the organization and the affected community themselves to absorb that into cycles of decision making and improvement. So basically, we have remote sensing increasingly being used within the humanitarian community despite these gaps. So we're driving without a seatbelt, insurance, a license, but we're doing it, and it's only going to become even more ubiquitous. And so Signal, really, we decided that we shouldn't be doing operations anymore. We said stop. We left Satellite Sentinel Project for a variety of reasons, but key among them is primum non nocere. What does that mean in Latin? First, say it together, first do no harm. So nocere being harm. You can't first do no harm if you don't know what the harm is. We are attempting to say first do no harm without knowing the harm. We don't have a theory of harm for how the introduction of remote sensing as a unique capacity for situational awareness in armed conflict environments can put the capacity of armed actors, of the perps, of the bad guys, on steroids. Now, we can't say to a level of scientific causality, did SSP give the Sudan Armed Forces and rebel groups an enhanced capacity? And I don't even know how to construct that experiment ethically. But what we did notice is that there were adaptions occurring correlatively as we were injecting this unique form of situational awareness for, quote, ambient protective purposes into an environment we didn't fully understand, let alone control the parameters of. Examples. They launched their major attacks during Sentinel on long American holiday weekends in many cases, under cloud cover at night. Why do you think they're doing that? We saw the use of different types of cover evolving over time. Now, the fact is that we're never going to know, did we cause that? Even though Bashir called George Clooney George Looney. So we know they're paying attention. But the point is that that's not good enough. That means fundamentally, if we accept that we are going to use these crisis environments as experimental labs, we are doing things that the FDA would prohibit in the United States. You do it in Africa, you might win a Nobel Peace Prize. That equity issue in terms of what we're doing really raises a key definitional requirement. How do we know that a remote sensing technology has gotten to operational test level, to be able to put it in the field to a level of knowing the harm? And when is it experimental? It's not about not experimenting. It's about setting the parameters. Recent report came out from Sean Martin McDonald called Ebola, a big data disaster. And he found that the use of CDRs, of call detail records, during the Ebola pandemic last year violated domestic laws in West Africa, may have violated international laws, wasn't clear why it was being done, and we didn't know if it was working. That's experimentation. And so I have a lot of things I want to say, but what's my time check? All right, we'll keep cruising. So basically how humanitarians are using remote sensing and mapping data can be divided into two broad baskets. One is what I would call detection, and the other I would call documentation. So detection, basically defined as, is a reconnaissance posture to get near real-time situational awareness about either non-permissive environments, aka if we go there they will shoot us, or huge, large geographic areas, or areas that have been affected by a natural disaster, in a way preventing access. So on the detection side, it's basically three big uses. Where are the displaced people? What are the most damage affected areas? And basically the third is, can we move personnel and assets into those areas or out of those areas? So egress assessment. Meanwhile, on documentation side, which often occurs simultaneously or right after detection, you have three big use cases: is multi-temporal change detection of growth or contraction of IDP or refugee camps. A second is really trying to understand violence patterns over time. So Central African Republic, the use of thermal anomaly data such as MODIS or TIRS. And then I think the third big documentation area, which I'll get to more in a little bit, is baselines. The creation of baseline mapping products or baseline assessments to do that change detection. Now, we actually don't have very much data about how these technologies are actually being used, by whom, at what level of organizations, community-based, headquarters, country level. And so that's why in the next year, we've decided that we're only going to do two things. We are going to do a survey to try to assess how the actual evidence quantitatively of who's using what for what. And the second is minimum technical standards and best practices. We have sphere standards, humanitarian standards for how we set up a tent. We don't have it for how we use data. And we certainly don't have it for how we use remote sensing, let alone unmanned aerial vehicles, etc. That's the big need. So we've decided no more technological innovation for at least the next year. We're pressing the red button at the factory. As I told my team, if you come with a partnership with a small NGO that's got a tech company and $15,000 and a can of Jolt Cola and a hackathon, I don't want to hear about it. I just don't. I want us to put the cart in front of the horse. Wait, put the horse in front of the cart and start with what we should have started with all along. What's the need? What defines humanitarians is need-based action. Instead, we have defined it by potential possibility. So that leads us into our remote sensing history, now about a decade in or so, fundamentally not being needs-based, and thus not being in consistent observance of the humanitarian principles. And this is another big area, is the reliance on data philanthropy, in many cases, has caused us to potentially run afoul of independence and neutrality. If we took a ton of grain, but we could only use it where Monsanto told us to, that would not necessarily be humanitarian. But we do it with data all the time. And so that raises an even broader question. When is data aid? If there is a right to food, water, shelter as minimum requirements for the sustainment of life, is there such a thing for data, for satellite images? That's a big question, and the Geneva Convention doesn't answer it. And it leads to another problem, which is we know if I blow up a hospital and I'm Assad, I've committed a war crime most likely. But what if I shut off your cell network? What if I blow up a pipeline, which happened, to potentially evade satellite surveillance? Is that a cyber war crime? No.
Not according to the Geneva Convention.
Yes, right now, it's no. Right now, you can turn off the cell grid to go kill everyone in the Baba Ammar neighborhood. The killing in the neighborhood, crime. Cell grid interdiction, not so much. So basically, these are the questions that need to be occupying us before how do we deploy the tech. And I think that, let me end on some good news before questions, which is at the end of this month, we are publishing with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs data preparedness. And what data preparedness is what we believe a new core competency, not only for mappers, but especially mappers and analysts, and for anyone managing data in a disaster. What do you need to have in place in your humanitarian ecosystem to deploy data based on baselines, based on a needs assessment? So data preparedness is the attempt to begin that doctrinal development. It follows our publication last month with OCHA of the first, and with NYU and University of Leiden in the Netherlands, of the first outline of what is a data responsibility cycle in terms of managing data collection and analysis. So let me summarize my talk, and I hope I wasn't bouncing around like a kangaroo here, but summarize my talk by saying this: what the future will look like will not be determined by our technological capability. It will be determined by our capabilities in three areas. Our ability to have a theory of actionability, an action theory based on data, so we are using remote sensing in support of those decision points. The second is it will be based on how we deal with the ethical problem of demographically identifiable information, period. And that will determine the trust of communities in organizations that deploy these technologies. Those that cannot manage DII risks and threats will basically be breaking the social compact with those communities, who will become resistant to surveillance, what they may perceive as surveillance, that affects them without a say in it. And the third area that will determine the future of these technologies is basically how we make it consistent with humanitarian principles. If this becomes an area of digital inequity and data disparities, where certain populations are receiving certain types of support over others, that will cause a schism, and it will affect adoption, it will affect absorption. And the answer to that is fundamentally, to this gentleman here, Geneva says no. Well, we need to go back to that. We may need new laws. We may need new treaties. So in a sentence, our technology is adapted faster than our theories, our ethics, and our laws. And just to end on a scary note, in the aftermath of the tragedy of Orlando, I'm reminded of a story a colleague from a unnamed European country told me about an LGBT group that he worked with. And this LGBT group was responding to skinhead attacks in this unnamed European country on nightclubs. And so they deployed a map to map the incidents with the idea that was documenting and detecting, right? Within 24 to 48 hours, the number of attacks went through the roof. They were deploying to the skinheads otherwise unavailable situational awareness about the location and the movement patterns of their targets. This is where the rubber meets the road. If we don't know how to not do that, then that will determine adoption, it will determine evolution, and it will determine our relevance in humanitarian response, but also civil society at large. Thank you.
We have lots of times for questions, so questions.
Good, I answered it all. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. This is very inspiring. My half question, half comment really is that technology and the three principles that you emphasized in your talk, do they necessarily counter interact, or they can actually enhance each other, or at least do no harm to one the other, meaning that the problem of technology in your cases are really real and needs a lot of attention. But is that the fault of the technology, or is the fault of not knowing how to use it properly? And so we can improve, and we can also improve the use of technology along the way. Thanks.
It's absolutely not the technology's fault. It's not the technology's fault. It really is the lack of a management theory about how you build innovation into institutions around a type of data that we're not ready for yet. And I think that conferences like this are really important, because if I have one call to action, which is we need spaces that are funded and supported to have humanitarians or whatever group of practitioners in the room with the technologists, in the room with the ethicists and the lawyers. And the way funding, we have a political economy, okay, as I said before, about nickel and dime investments to million-dollar problems. It's even deeper than that. I would prefer nickel and dime investments into holistic interdisciplinary spaces to create tiger teams to attack these problems jointly. But now we're reliant on basically one horse or the other, but I lost the metaphor. Let it go. I have sort of the Budweiser Clydesdale wagon in my mind, but that didn't work. So basically, we do not have the resources centralized in spaces with the mandate to create interdisciplinary responsible use doctrine. Doctrine is not sexy. What's sexy is I have an app that can beep every time a refugee is in danger, okay? But that's not how it works. And so we've allowed a blind spot here on this technological development where we've had the potential preclude the responsibility or how we execute the responsibility.
Thank you. Great talk, and it speaks to the heart of a lot of the things I'm covering. Have you not been here?
I have not been here.
Okay, well-
I've been at another talk across town at the
All right,
docks.
well, I'm Lee Schwartz. I'm the State Department geographer, and we've done a lot of work in this area, and we've had a lot of interactions with the same groups that you've been working with. I just want to, what's come up a lot during the course of the past day here is, and specifically the project we're working on in secondary cities, is fundamental to that project is the fact that all data are open and owned by the communities that are working on them. And I think that, and part of the Satellite Sentinel project that created potential ethical problems was it was done by an organization, not necessarily at the behest of the people in the region. So when data are available and free and open, then you democratize access to information, and you encourage groups like the Bellingcat Group, for instance, where they're really doing top-notch imagery analysis. They may not be trained geospatial scientists, but the democratization and the availability of data encourages innovation at the local levels, not at the institutional level. So I think, in part, you're approaching this from the institutional framework, which is important, and I think those are the groups that need to be seriously concerned about ethics. But the other side of the coin is when the data are free and open, there's another set of concerns that is less institutional, and you didn't really address that in your conversations. So I just wanted to bring you up to speed as to this project and some of the discussions we've had on open data and its value. Thanks a lot.
So thank you, Lee. 3 quick reactions. One, this is not my line. This is the engine room's line, but data is people. Say it with me. Data is people. Okay? We start there. Data is people. If we can't build systems that are based on the recognition that data is people, then you shouldn't be doing it. Stop. The second point is, to your point directly, Lee, it is about localization and ownership. That was the failure of SSP, in the sense that we were in an operational environment where that wasn't possible. So the question is not just do it anyhow, but it is, what are the baseline requirements of ownership and of feedback loops? And we identify that in the data responsibility paper with OCHA. That should be the prerequisite. If the community itself is not owning the data and initiating the deployment based on their needs, then we need to have some very clear rules about whether there are moments that can happen outside of that paradigm. Obviously, extreme natural disasters, et cetera, but the key, you're right, my talk today is about the institutional perspective. The whole other side of it, and my colleagues from Signal here in the room, Fang Greenwood, our UAV program lead, what we're focusing on next is how do we do community engagement in an ethics-based way? What's the checklist? How, especially looking at UAVs, how do we have that data ownership on the local level and that initiation of deployment coming from the population? That is the challenge. Any other questions?